A warning that this programme contains readings from historical archive which include language regarding race that listeners may find offensive.
This is Billy Kay, celebrating the life of R.B. Cunninghame Graham, one of the most remarkable Scots of the 19th and 20th centuries, whose influence extends as far as Spain, Morocco, South America and the American West. There, his direct experience of the frontier led him to write brilliant articles in the British press, condemning the destruction of the American Indian way of life and the appalling massacre of the Lakota Sioux at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Chris Dixon is Head of Languages at Dublin Institute of Technology and is involved in the American Indian College Fund.
He writes about the murder of the great Lakota holy man Tatangiyotake, who was known as Sitting Bull to white people, one of the most iconic and best known American Indian people of his time. And Sitting Bull was murdered, and after his murder, his family had to flee to Pine Ridge, where the Wounded Knee Massacre took place. So his direct descendants grew up very close to where the Wounded Knee Massacre took place, and he has one surviving great-grandson, Kangesie, Ernie Lapointe. And I am privileged to be able to call Ernie a friend. And I was able to give Ernie a copy of Cunninghame Graham's letter about the murder of his great-grandfather. And he was very moved by it. For someone who had actually lived that experience of the frontier to be writing about Indian people like that, in the way that he wrote about the killing of Sitting Bull, Ernie found that surprising and quite moving.
But now, back to the penultimate programme on the great man's life in my archive series from 1999, Don Roberto, the Aristocratic Socialist.
I like to see him putting his fingers through his long, thick, golden red hair, making it stand high above his fine, narrow, aristocratic forehead, twirling his mustachios and holding his handsome person proudly erect. He would stride into the room with the swagger of a gaucho and the elegance of a swordsman.
Graham himself, though an adventurous, flamboyant figure, was a figure who was also, at times, deeply pessimistic. So there's an interesting contrast between the political activist and the pessimist who, in certain writings, emphasises transience, decay, mortality. He's always trying to memorialise fleeting moments, but he knows they are fleeting.
Cedric Watts of the University of Sussex, and the words of William Rothenstein, one of many great artists who painted Don Roberto, on the enigma of a romantic, swashbuckling pessimist. Rothenstein portrayed him as the fencer, and he was a gifted swordsman, said to be disappointed when he didn't come in first in an international fencing competition held in Paris. But as he reached his mid-30s, Cunninghame Graham was to engage increasingly in a very different kind of fighting, and one with far-reaching consequences. His great-niece, Jean Polwarth.
Keir Hardie actually said to my uncle, I think you should go to Parliament and tell them the kind of things we want to do, because they're not ready for me with my cloth cap yet. And you have a whole lot of relations of your own sort in Parliament, so they'll accept you, and you can start saying all the things we want to say. And when you get fed up with it, you can hand over to me and you can prepare them for me. And that was really the way it went.
I think Cunninghame Graham was the revolutionary, Hardie was the reformer. Hardie only ever wanted to go so far, but Cunninghame Graham, I think, had imbibed revolutionary principles in South America and had some pretty good ideas of his own. So, for example, in the riots in 1888, when he was speaking in Trafalgar Square, he'd urged people not to starve, but pointing out the obvious, that there was money in the banks, food in the shops, clothes in the shops, go and help yourself. And of course he was arrested and jailed for having expressed these ideas.
Elspeth King of Stirling Smith Art Gallery and Museum. Graham had experienced despotism in South America and was impatient for radical democratic change in Britain. But he also realised that responsibility for change had to come from working people. He saw himself merely as a catalyst.
I believe that the people themselves will work out their own emancipation, kicking off here a bolt, there a bar, loosening their chains link by link. As a horse let out of a dark stable does not run at first but stares blindly about him, so do the people emerging from their dark stable of ignorance. They will run in good time, and what I want to see is a fair open field for them to exercise their efforts upon.
Cunninghame Graham was in Parliament before Hardy and had much stronger socialist ideas. When it came to having to support unemployed groups or support revolutionaries like those who were thrown out of Paris in 1871, when it came to having to support women's rights for women wanting the vote, Cunninghame Graham was always there, putting the point across so eloquently and so well. And because he was an aristocrat, he's sometimes disregarded as not being part of the Labour movement. And the other trouble is, of course, he went on to found the National Party of Scotland in 1928, and often Labour and nationalism don't see eye to eye, so he's not been given his due acknowledgement.
Graham was an enormously popular figure among the crofters, whose cause he'd taken up, among miners, among working class people right across Scotland. You could buy postcards of Labour heroes in Glasgow, for example, in the 1890s. The figures were Karl Marx, Keir Hardie, sometimes Peter Kropotkin, and Cunninghame Graham. There was a tremendous love and affection for him, as one Ayrshire miner said to a sceptical reporter from one of the London dailies, "You just tell them in London we love our Graham."
Dr. Lawrence Davis of Dartmouth College, New Hampshire. From 1878 onwards, Graham's passion for radical politics had the support of a remarkable woman, with whom he shared a loving marriage and astonishing travels in Spain and Mexico and on the wagon trains of the American West. She was Caroline Horsfall, an actress who had run away from a bourgeois Yorkshire family, but her true identity was concealed as she joined the adventure of being with Cunninghame Graham.
I think Uncle Robert was probably expected to marry the heiress to some great estate in Scotland to retrieve the family fortunes, as was rather the way of things in those days. That's what happened. And I think he thought his family were going to be furious that he'd fallen in love with this penniless girl from Yorkshire who'd run away and had been cut off by her family. So he thought he'd dress it up a bit. And anyway, they both had this rather lovely romantic idea about life, so they pretended she was a Chilean princess or something, and when they signed the registry office marriage certificate, they signed it as Gabriella de la Belmondière, which is, anybody could see it was a totally pretend name, and Robert put his name as Roberto.
This plaque is to Gabriella Cunninghame Graham. She was a campaigner for women's rights. She was an excellent writer herself. She was a botanist. She smoked little black cigars, which is a relic of living abroad to keep the flies and the mosquitoes off. And she must have caused a near sensation on the platforms of the area round about when she campaigned for women's rights, and also she wouldn't automatically fit into the county set.
They were obviously devoted to each other. A lot of people say, then why were they always rushing off in opposite directions? Well, I think they were both very adventurous people. He was tied down as an MP, so she used to go off. She decided she was going to write a biography of Santa Teresa of Avila, and so she used to go off to Spain, and she went all over the place. She was very brave. She went by herself and stayed in all sorts of strange places.
She was also a very spiritual woman. She wrote a 2-volume account of St. Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystic, which still stands to this day as a definitive work.
The writer Rennie McCohen, speaking beside Gabriella's grave on the island of Inchmahome on the Lake of Menteith. Cunninghame Graham was somewhat less spiritual, saying memorably, "I sometimes wish I could believe in religion, for if I did, I could be sure that Gladstone is in hell." For a while, Don Roberto concentrated his considerable energies at Westminster, endearing himself to its members by calling it an asylum for incapables.
From 1886 to 1892, he was a member of Parliament, and a very vigorous, at times almost violent one. He was involved in stormy scenes. He got in as a Liberal, but it was soon clear, virtually from his maiden speech, that he was a very left-wing figure indeed, a figure who was friends at this time with William Morris, and in his speeches he would advocate the cause of the unemployed, would denounce capitalism and imperialism, would advocate free secular education, and when a Conservative MP said, "Mr. Cunninghame Graham, you are preaching the doctrines of pure unmitigated socialism," he replied, "Undoubtedly," and it's in Hansard if you don't believe me.
He loved dealing with hecklers when he was standing for Parliament. And there was one, apparently, where one of the hecklers said to him, "I believe your ancestor killed King James I." And Uncle Robert said, "Probably, but go to hell and ask him yourself." That was the kind of remark that he'd make, and he really enjoyed that kind of repartee.
I think he enjoyed his reputation as a rebel. He was rather pleased with it, would play up to it, would magnify it in certain respects.
He loved drama, and that's again why Shaw loved to borrow him as a character. There's famous words of his, "I never withdraw," when the Speaker asked him to behave himself and retract an accusation against another MP, for example, and that one resulted in his being suspended from the House. Time and again you see pictures of him in a characteristic pose, his arms folded defiantly, and you look at the stage directions of Arms on the Man, that's exactly how Saranoff, the cavalry officer, stands. Hector Hushabye in Heartbreak House is perhaps another version of Graham. He loved acting up, he loved performing, he was very conscious of the theatrical side of politics.
Before addressing a potentially rowdy socialist meeting in Glasgow, Cunninghame Graham picked up a prop left backstage by the local amateur dramatic society and, gun raised, told the astonished crowd that if anyone interrupted his friend Keir Hardie, they would leave the hall in a coffin. He got silence, then laughter, but more crucially, a responsive audience for pioneering socialism. His contribution was valued by Friedrich Engels. On the streets, he was prepared to lead by example, bearing the brunt of a police baton charge and suffering 4.5 weeks in Pentonville prison after the original Bloody Sunday of 1887. Many of his political contemporaries and most of his social peers thought he was going too far. Family member Jamie Jauncey and Hamish Fraser of Strathclyde University.
He's a man for scenes. There are those. Mrs. Webb, for example, described him as a poser who had no sense at all when it came to politics. And both outside and inside Parliament, he did think scenes were important in order to capture public attention. He took part in the Great Trafalgar Square demonstrations that the Socialist organised on behalf of the unemployed and got a bloody head from the police who charged the crowds on that occasion.
And then there's the true anecdote that he got his photograph taken in his prison garb and distributed as his official photograph as Deputy Lieutenant of the County of Stirling. That must have caused consternation.
A lot of them must have found him very alarming indeed, because he was rocking the boat furiously all the time.
Would they have regarded his socialism or his nationalism as the greatest sin?
Oh, gosh, hard to say. I mean, I think they would have probably been terrified by both, wouldn't they?
There's a cartoon by Spy in Vanity Fair of Cunninghame Graham in prison. There he is in prison in the convict's uniform with a broad arrow design on it, but the left cuff is turned back half an inch, showing a line of white. And that was deliberate, because Cunninghame believed in representations of himself there should always be a splash of white or a touch of white. So even in prison uniform, he's still trying to be the dandy.
He did other things which were part of the landowning way of life at the time. I mean, he went to the big social events such as Ascot, and we know he was extremely well-mannered and courteous, and in the style of the time. When he came back from Latin America and other countries, he brought the costume of the country with him, and he would wear it sometimes. He's supposed to have gone to the Ascot races with a kind of gaucho-style knife strapped on below his coattails. And there's an anecdote of him passing George Bernard Shaw and Shaw's mother in the street, and he doffed his hat to them as he passed with this great sweep. And Shaw's mother said, "Who's that?" And Shaw said, "That's Cunninghame Graham." And the mother said, "Nonsense. Cunninghame Graham's one of your socialists. That man's a gentleman."
Gentleman or no, Bernard Shaw, like many artists of the time, was fascinated by Don Roberto, who served as a model for the heroes of both Arms and the Man and Captain Brassbound's Conversion, the latter based unashamedly on Cunninghame Graham's Moroccan travel book, Maghreb El Aqsa. The playwright on why he didn't do the decent thing and simply call his hero Don Roberto.
Cunninghame Graham is the hero of his own book, but I have not made him the hero of my play, because so incredible a personage must have destroyed its likelihood, such as it is. There are moments when I do not myself believe in his existence, and yet he must be real, for I have seen him with these eyes. He is a fascinating mystery to a sedentary person like myself. The horse, a dangerous animal whom, when I cannot avoid, I propitiate with apples and sugar. He bestrides and dominates fearlessly. He is, I understand, a Spanish hidalgo, hence the superbity of his portrait by Lavery, Velasquez being no longer available. He is, I know, a Scotch laird. How he continues to be authentically the two things at the same time is no more intelligible to me than the fact that everything that has ever happened to him seems to have happened in Paraguay or Texas instead of Spain or Scotland.
Or Morocco. Written in 1897, Maghreb El Aqsa sees Graham disguised as an Arab horseman in order to penetrate to the forbidden city of Taroudant. He doesn't succeed, he doesn't care. Kirsty Wishart of St Andrews University.
It's this idea that absolutely nowhere is off limits for Western travellers, that they can automatically take on the garb of those who are lower down the racial scale from them and infiltrate these secret places. You get that completely reversed in Cunninghame Graham's work. He does take on the guise of a native, but is ultimately uncovered. His journey effectively stops. He isn't able to reach the city. And yet we don't get the sense of failure from that. If anything, his misadventures means that he's able to have a greater degree of contact with the natives of Morocco.
A prisoner for 12 days of the Caid of Kentafi, and with no sign of escape, Graham hires someone to carry a secret plea for intervention over the Atlas Mountains to the British consul in Mogador. A day later, the man returns, the message undelivered.
The poor man sat quite patiently, and then replied it was no use to curse him. His heart had failed, and that he feared if he were found out, the Caid would kill him, burn his house, and throw his children into prison to rot and die. Though I was much annoyed, I was sorry for him, as one is always sorry for all those whose hearts fail at the wrong minute, and I was touched that he had brought me the $2 back. Most likely in his life he had never seen himself at the head of so much capital, and it would have been easy for him to throw away the packet and not return. Therefore, I handed him $1 and remarked, those who have families should not engage in enterprises such as these. God loves stout-hearted men, but perhaps loves quite as much fathers who love their children. But children or no children, we are all in his hand. This, though they had heard it 1,000,000 times, seemed to console all present, and the messenger slunk from the tent ashamed, but happy, having been paid on a scale he thought was lavish for a mere 22 hours' walk.
Graham's humanitarian vision, eloquently expressed. The pessimism is contained in a humorous footnote where he begins to doubt whether the man had ever actually set out on the mission at all. But I consoled myself by thinking that even if this were so, I had paid more money to see worse acting in a theatre. As the 19th century drew to a close, Graham became more and more disillusioned with British society and the family at its head.
I'm afraid he wasn't very keen on the royal family, actually, which was rather unusual in those days. But his brother went as an equerry to King Edward VII and subsequently to King George V, and Uncle Robert didn't approve at all.
Later, in his sketch Might, Majesty and Dominion, he brought his impressionist sensibility to bear on a moment within the pageantry of Queen Victoria's funeral of 1901.
He describes the Rajas riding past, he describes the cavalry regiments, he describes the carriages, and then he describes what the other commentators don't describe, and that is, at the end of the procession, a poor man foraging among the discarded sandwich packets, looking for food. It's a sight that's still with us, and it's a sight that makes many people look away. Graham doesn't look away.
At length, they all dispersed, and a well-bred and well-fed dog or two roamed to and fro, sniffing disdainfully at the remains of the rejected food which the fallen papers held. Lastly, a man, grown old in the long reign of the much-mourned ruler whose funeral procession had just passed, stumbled about, slipping upon the muddy grass, and taking up a paper from the mud, fed ravenously on that which the two dogs had looked at with disdain. His hunger satisfied, he took up of the fragments that remained a pocketful, and then, whistling a snatch from a forgotten opera, slouched slowly onward, and was swallowed by the gloom.
Also, having travelled in West Africa, Graham had witnessed the excesses of empire, and in his sketch Niggers, attacked prevailing attitudes among the Celto-Saxon tribe and its natural leader, the tweed-clad Englishman.
This is a ferocious satiric diatribe. It's almost a rewriting of the story of the creation in Genesis, but from the point of view, predominantly, of a jingoistic Englishman. And the point Graham's making is that racism and imperialism are disgusting, go hand in hand, and racism is summed up in that phrase, bloody niggers.
The Ethiopian cannot change his skin, and therefore we are ready to possess his land and to uproot him for the general welfare of mankind, smiting him hip and thigh as the Jews did the Canaanites when first they opened up the promised land. Niggers who have no cannons have no rights. Their land is ours, their cattle and their fields, their houses, ours, their arms, their poor utensils, and everything they have. Their women, too, are ours to use as concubines, to beat, exchange, to barter off for gunpowder or gin, ours to infect with syphilis, leave with child, outrage, torment, and make by contact with the vilest of our vile more vile than beasts.
Graham's conclusion to the piece anticipates the Herrenvolk mentality, which surfaced elsewhere in Europe just a few decades later.
England's great heart is sound. It beats for all the sorrows of mankind. We must press on. We owe it to ourselves and to our God. Ours to perform our duty, his to provide the field. The world is ours. Let us press on to do our mutual will.
It's difficult to imagine now just how prevalent the ideas of imperialism and empire were, and so to question those values was really to strike at the heart of something very important to Britons at the time. To write as forcefully, I think, marks him out as someone rather unusual. Now, because his views do match our own ones in relation to racism or anti-imperialism, hopefully now we have the maturity, if you like, to fully appreciate what he was saying.
Cunninghame Graham was ahead of his time in many of his views, and although he lost enthusiasm for both the Labour and Liberal parties in later life, he never deserted his millenarian socialist beliefs, which harked back to the ideals of aesthetic visionaries like William Morris. At the age of 67, he wrote,
"Often with sea boots on, or wet and miserable in a railway truck with the horses in the Argentine, or with the skipper on the bridge looking out for torpedoes, I have thought, where are the dreams of Morris? But on arriving at port, or at the camp, they have come back. They always do. Let us, I say, cherish them. Valet."
He also maintained his friendship with the more renowned socialist pioneer.
Keir Hardie became a great friend of my Uncle Robert, and in fact they went through a lot of difficult times together, and this is what's so nice in a letter that he wrote to my great uncle when Uncle Robert's wife Gabriella died in 1906, saying, "We have been through so much together, and in the days gone by have been so much to each other, that a feeling of kinship has grown up in my mind, which almost makes your griefs mine also."
Gabriella's sudden death was devastating for Cunninghame Graham. He was to visit her grave on Inchmahome constantly for 30 years, until he himself was buried beside her in 1936. I'll leave you there in that beautiful setting with myself, Rennie McCohen, and the haunting poem Gabriella wrote for her husband, and all who have loved someone and lost them.
Certain places have atmosphere and fey attachments, and I think Inchmahome is one of these places. I mean, there are too many memories here for it not to be like that, and it suits Cunninghame Graham. We have these two slabs on the ground, one Gabriella's name and dates and one with Cunninghame Graham's, and it's interesting that on Gabriella's the Christian cross is carved, and on Cunninghame Graham's grave we have the brand of his horses, and then there's a second plaque to Gabriella on the wall just above the two graves.
It says, in memory of Gabriella Cunninghame Graham of Gartmore, who died at Hendaye, France, 8th September 1906, aged 45.
That's right.
Then a Spanish proverb, Los muertos abren los ojos a los que viven. The dead open the eyes of those who live.
Yes. Well, Cunninghame Graham brought her body back to Scotland, and he dug the grave himself with the help of one retainer. And that's one of the most moving passages, I think, in some of the biographies of him, because it was obviously an act of love that he dug the grave himself with the help of one other person. It must have been a moment of immense grief for him.
Love, when I am dead, I shall not be very far. I will peep in at your window, a faint white star. Or when the wind arises, see the cedar tips. They'll be my ghost-like fingers, seeking for your lips. I'll rest the coffin lid and speed me from my lair. You will feel the aura of my presence steal softly through your hair. Forgotten, unforgetting, for you I cannot die, nor you for me. We've drunk too deep love's immortality.